Hello, Zer0 Books viewers, this is Craig, and you are about to watch a discussion or a debate between Graham Harman, Vinay Gupta, and Bruce Sterling. This debate was hosted by an experimental art space in Baton Rouge, Louisiana called Yes We Cannibal. And today I have the honor of meeting with the stewards of that space, some friends of mine, Matt Keel and Liz Lesner. Yes We Cannibal is a unique community art space, and they do much more than just art. They have a community fridge, they have a food forest, and much more. But rather than me explain that, let's have Matt and Liz tell you what it is that they do. How are you doing today, Matt and Liz?
Yeah, so we call ourselves a free and experimental project space for new art and thought, and we host Sunday salons that are always free and that can include artist talks, author talks, performances, philosophy talks, and
naturalists.
All kinds of things. We also have a gallery, and we host short residencies.
All of our Sunday salons, because it was a pandemic adaptation, almost all of them we tend to stream on Twitch and then archive on YouTube. So we kind of do a balance of having the local community come in and check things out that are always free. And then also we have a kind of big international network of folks too. We do a lot of music events these days as well. We have a monthly hip hop showcase that we are proud of. We also offer harm reduction services. So I sometimes like to say that I feel like we're the meeting of a really fancy Beverly Hills art gallery and like a kind of crusty punk info shop.
Now, if people want to support you, whether it's in the Baton Rouge area or maybe from afar, somewhere online, how can they do that and how can they reach out to you?
Well, we really need Patreon supporters, so that would be a great help. And one of the perks of our Patreon is that any level of support is entered into a monthly raffle where artists who show here donate a piece of artwork. And no matter what level you join at, you are eligible to win one of these pieces of artwork.
We've actually had a young person who donated at the $1 level win a piece of art. But one of the key things about Yes We Cannibal, one of the fantasies when we started was that we did not want to be a nonprofit. We wanted to be an anti-profit. And so we came up with the idea to see if we can demonstrate in the course of our time the ability to run an experimental space like this, which we think is critical for the future and for art and for thought, to see if it can be run on micro patronage. So is it possible to kind of come up with a workable budget that can truly be met solely by small donations, regular committed donations from people who see the value of what we're doing and believe in it? And of course, we are also patrons. So that's a very kind of critical part of the whole project, is sort of an experiment in seeing whether or not we can activate and mobilize people around the world to believe this is important.
And if you're local to Baton Rouge, we really depend on the support of our volunteers that help us run all these programs, from the food forest to the community fridge to the events that we host. So those are both great ways to support us.
And before we start the debate, maybe you can say a little bit about what Zer0 Books viewers are about to see.
So there's a bit of a backstory, which is that we met Vinay Gupta in passing and had a fantastic conversation with him some time back. I think he's extremely interesting in many regards. He's a brilliant mind, he's a humanitarian, and he's also someone who is involved in crypto and involved in, something which many people are kind of having a backlash against right now. And we then met Graham as well, I think really through social media, I would guess, and are quite interested in his work, and suddenly had the insight that there was kind of a shared obsession with objects. In some sense, Vinay's project is all about materium and trying to kind of create this simulated archive of all the objects in the world to put towards humanitarian purposes, potentially. And of course, certainly your viewers are familiar with Graham, the role of objects in Graham's thought and ontology. And so we thought it would be fascinating and had a preliminary meeting with them. And they sort of took off and had a really interesting dynamic, and we were just kind of thrilled. And as it turned out, they both knew Bruce. So it was a very unexpected connection. I believe that Graham knew him, I think, through SciArc, and if I understand correctly, he perhaps sat on the board or was involved with one of Vinay's companies. And so, at the last minute, the great Bruce Sterling joined the panel as well. So it was extremely exciting to us, and that's what we're about to watch.
I work on object-oriented ontology, which is a kind of philosophy I've been developing since my doctoral thesis in the late 1990s. And object-oriented ontology is often the first thing people think they know about it is that it talks about how objects are withdrawn. Objects are hidden. You can't see them or know them directly. And that's not especially new because there are aspects of that, of course, in Kant's thing in itself and in Heidegger's being, which withdraws from any direct access. That's a part of object-oriented ontology. But what object-oriented ontology is really about is the strange relation that objects have with their own qualities. The fact that objects both have certain qualities, but they can also lose qualities while remaining themselves. And this has big implications both for aesthetics and for our conception of what knowledge is. And it's been picked up a lot in disciplines outside of philosophy. I'm teaching at an architecture school now because architects have found some use for this. And my first book on architecture is coming out this summer. It shouldn't be the last, but it'll be the first. Artists, also. I am co-authoring a book with archaeologist Christopher Whitmore at Texas Tech about the relation between O and architecture. There's actually some there as well. And more generally, every field that exists has some interest in talking about individual units and what happens when they come into relation. How can they pull apart from relations? And so this is one of the reasons it's been picked up on such a wide interdisciplinary scale. And in some respects, I was assisted in that by Bruno Latour, who was never officially my teacher, but kind of a mentor, an older figure who was very well established in his actor network theory, which kind of paved the way for O to enter into some of the same fields. The big difference is that for Latour, objects are defined in terms of their relations. For O, objects are defined as that which is partly withdrawn from all relations. And I think that'll come up in some of the questions that are going to be asked today. So I'll leave it at that for now and pass it on to my colleagues here.
Bruce, you want to go next?
All right, sure. You can appoint yourself your chairman, our chairman. Okay, I'm not a metaphysician. I'm a science fiction writer, but I do have aesthetic problems. And most of my aesthetic problems show up because I'm the art director of Share Festival in Turin, and where, my wife and I have spent rather a lot of our time. And Share Festival is a technology art festival. And we're very keen on, methods of expression made by objects and machines and systems and services that are not normally used for art practice. So one of our big problems is like how to assess works of generative art, right? Or machine-made art, or lately we've been getting a lot of artificial intelligence art. So you've got like normal aesthetic kind of problems with like human artists, and then you've got like these programmed systems that are like coming up with such and such. Okay, it's our job to sort of figure out like who gets the award. So what is it you're trying to what is it you're trying to encourage with these things, right? I mean, what's actually artistic about them, right? I mean, and how can you tell the difference between sort of a good generated system and one that's not? And and a lot of those problems there are actually metaphysical. I mean, what is it that is happening? I mean, what is the viewer seeing, but also what is the system doing that has produced something that actually is of interest to the human sensorium, right? So, I'm very interested in kinetic art too, because Turin is an industrial town, and our viewership, our supporters, our public, are from an engineering town where Fiat is, and they're quite big on gadgets, and they actually like sort of the bigger and uglier and more dangerous ones. Our most successful machines have tended to be things that look like they can kill you. They have a certain Mark Pauline survival research lab cyberpunk tinge to them. So you have to sort of make aesthetic decisions about how much danger you're going to put the viewer into and how likely this device is to actually maim somebody. And, the Graham being electrocuted is a very lively possibility for us. I mean, we really don't want to electrocute any 7-year-olds, and yet we don't want to merely come out with anodyne, meek little machines that don't do anything very interesting. So, how do you assess how a kinetic device behaves? I mean, what's it supposed to be doing? Is it supposed to be full of sci-fi, shock, awe, and horror? I mean, is it good if it has some Lovecraftian tinge? Like, in some of our most successful things in that, I mean, successful in terms of like bringing in foot traffic, have been machines which are quite horrible. I mean, we had like a whole series of Frankenstein-related machines, and those were extremely effective. I mean, the populace just ate those up with a spoon. They like scary devices. But you can also argue that what you're really looking for there is some kind of ballet-like mastery of mechanical movement in a three-dimensional space, right? Or even better, like an interactive mechanical device, which, people can approach, which will somehow see what they're doing and respond in some graceful and aesthetically attractive way. Okay, what is the system of perception and decision which is behaving in that way, right? And here metaphysics actually is of some use, right? I mean, even if you don't know how the thing's behaving, you ought to have some speculative idea of what it would be like if it was good when it was behaving, right? I mean, you don't want to show the code running. What you want is like something that works in front of the audience. I mean, A, it doesn't kill anybody. Second, a 7-year-old likes it. Third, it's not going to break into pieces or set fire to the building. Fourth, it needs to look pretty good. 5, it needs to stay in repair. And 6, it's good if the artist himself is an actual artist and you're trying to encourage him and be nice to him, right? And there just aren't many people who worry about this. I mean, there's always been a famine of kinetic art criticism. Nobody really knows to tell a machine how to dance, or even if it should dance. Maybe it should just do indescribable things, right? But in this sense, speculative realism and well, I like speculative realism because in science fiction we speculate all the time. So I find that more attractive than object-oriented ontology, because in my line of work there, if you start talking about ontology, the building empties immediately. They're there to see a show, okay? They don't actually want a metaphysical lecture, but it helps if you have some kind of, I mean, you can't have an aesthetics without a metaphysics, because aesthetics is about what things, how things appeal to the human sensorium, or, maybe a machine sensorium if you ever had machines who were buying art, and that could happen. So yeah, these are issues of mine that I have never mastered, but I'm grateful when somebody shows up from another line of work like object-oriented ontology and starts making some kind of splash. I mean, it probably isn't a permanent solution to my curatorial problems, but I'm actually glad that it's around. And happy to know more about it and befriend its practitioners even. Buy you spaghetti, really. Drop by Torino. We've got a budget.
Superb. So I guess I'm a practical man. So I run a sort of software company, takes physical objects, works with experts to build a legally binding definition of what that object is, and then helps people sell those objects. So it's a kind of like a postmodern auction house with too many lawyers. The last thing we sold was a famous Australian DJ's trumpet, which was sold for $100,000, I think 4 days ago. And, the trumpet was accompanied by various sets of data about it. Each set of data about the trumpet was produced by a different person. We have a policy that we don't believe in truth. We only believe in legal liability, so everybody that wants to make a claim about the object has to put some money on the line. The object can be described in contradictory ways by different people. This person sees it this way, this person sees it this way. Both claims can be made until somebody decides to settle it in a court. We don't really have an opinion about what's true, but we don't have this policy of like, there are no truths in the system, there are only legal liabilities, is very much woven into a kind of actor network theory model. Particularly given that the truth is actually decided through a kind of an arbitration process, which is a process where we are, kind of picking our jurisdiction and so on in a way that is quite actively building out the sort of network that interprets truth around a specific object. And I'm fortunate or unfortunate enough to actually have an ontology department inside of the company, which is there to help us reason about what we can and cannot know with what degree of, reliability, or, to look out for problems where we have things like incompatible world models in ways that would create legal liability for somebody unintentionally. And, it's a ton of thinking very hard about how to describe things such that when somebody pays money for them, you don't wind up with somebody suing somebody else because of an avoidable problem that could be philosophical in nature. So carefully phrasing a legal promise about, in the style of, thought to be, from the workshop of, assessed as, there's lots of need for very careful use of language, because we want to say X is Y, but when that becomes a matter of academic opinion and you start trying to put this in the context of things like art collections, exactly how we know things and what it is we say we know and how we represent that knowledge to third parties all becomes like just a room full of mousetraps that a cat is attempting to pad foot its way through. So a little bit like Bruce has this practical application where he's, or judging art stuff. I have to think very hard about the way that we generate stories about things when those stories become the basis for somebody spending a lot of money buying something.
Vinay, for those in the audience who are not familiar with Materium, can you give the kind of pith description of what Materium does?
Sure. So in a nutshell, you want to buy and sell a house for cryptocurrency, right? I want to pay Bitcoin for gold bar. You want to pay Ethereum for a sketch, print done by Andy Warhol, right? So cryptocurrency, because the payments are non-repudiatable, you make the payment, you can't get your money back. You need much, much, much better buyer protection than you need in the real world. You go to Sotheby's, you buy a painting, it turns out to be fake. You go back to Sotheby's. If they feel it in their hearts, they might give you a refund. If they don't, they'll point to their terms of service and tell you to fuck off. But in the blockchain world, because when the money is paid, there's no refunds, there's no way of getting it back, you need much more assertive buyer protections. So the most fundamental conflict between buyers and sellers is the buyer says, I want a brand new widget, right? And the seller says, this is brand new. And the thing arrives and it's obviously slightly used. And now we have a dispute. And one of them says, well, it's as good as brand new. Why should I trade? And you wind up with this kind of argument about what words mean and what was described and what was meant and was it measured correctly and all the rest of this. And that tangle just burns time and money for all parties. And it means that people are reluctant to buy very high value objects online without seeing them. So the sort of notion is that you get third-party experts to look at the object, and it's like, tell me about this pair of binoculars. I want to buy it. I'm not going to look at it myself. You take a look at it and tell me what it's like. And having multiple third parties give you a description of a thing, where each one of those third parties is putting money behind their description, gives us a way of working with an asset that we haven't seen and allows us to buy an asset that we haven't seen, because what we have is multiple third-party independent corroboration from different angles, and the truth is commercial truth, which is why nothing goes into the system without money attached. So it's a very consciously brutalist approach to sorting out the persistent problems in e-commerce and enabling high-value e-commerce, but it really is 100% just show me the money. I don't care what you know. I don't care what your expert opinion is. I don't care what your professional reputation is. I don't care who you do your work for. You just tell me how much money somebody can have if you're wrong. And then the part where the intelligence is added back into that brutalism is the insurers look at these experts and say, this guy is pretty credible, sell him insurance cheap. This guy's a total hick. There's no way we're insuring that dude. And that approach of using the expert judgment of insurers as a proxy for things like professional credentials is just a way of banging the situation down to the part where it becomes a software problem rather than the equivalent of having to rebuild academia before you can get an opinion out of somebody. So it's a lot of very philosophically sophisticated people thought about that for a long time. One of our guys worked very closely with Latour. A lot of sophistication went into building something that at the end of the day looks like a £5 mallet. But that's what I do for a living.
It's one of the first geneses for this notion of a discussion was that in this kind of new contract and kind of the holder of this contract that you've invented in a way, as someone who kind of holds the liability for the object, that person in a sense is holding the story of the object and becomes responsible for it. So it feels as though there's kind of an innate connection in kind of how we talk about objects in object-oriented philosophy ontology. In reading, I don't know how many people here have read, but your pamphlet, your short book, How Stuff Works. Do I have the title right?
The Future
of Stuff, sorry, which is a great read, recommended. But in reading it, I'm struck, it feels very much like it's connected to process philosophy. It feels very, even through Latour and Harman. Graham, I know you have worked hard to actually kind of distinguish between two schools of process philosophy. And I wonder if you could say something about that. I know you've read Vinay's book recently, and I'm sort of curious for how you locate Vinay's sort of interest in enmeshment and kind of the object, the car that extends beyond simply the object of the car to the roadway and the petrol and the social relations, which actually hold it. How do you locate that within the two schools of process philosophy you identify?
Indeed, I just read Vinay's pamphlet last night, so it's very fresh in my mind. It is a great read, and I recommend it to everybody, and it's immediately available in Kindle quite cheaply, a few bucks. I would put Vinay on the side of the process philosophy that I associate with Latour and Whitehead, which is primarily a process philosophy geared towards relations. Vinay talks a lot in that pamphlet about how all of these tools we have do not work outside of a context for which they are specifically designed. That you're not going to be able to use a hammer if you don't have nails, and that there are much more interesting examples in his writing that you can check out for yourself. So that's one kind of process philosophy, and Whitehead uses that term. Then there's the other kind of process philosophy that is committed to the idea that everything is changing all the time. And I would want to point out that those are two very different ideas. Sometimes they go together, sometimes they don't. Things can be in a relation that never changes at all. Things can be in a very stable relation. But then this other school, which is
there's a where we really use it. Right? So in the business, we have this concept of things going into vaults. And one of the definitional features of a vault is time stops when something is a vault. In theory, in the perfect world, you put the thing into vaulting and it never changes, right? So this notion of like the constant changing nature of objects, we recognize that's real, but it's our enemy. If I put this painting in a vault 50 years from now, I want to take it out and I want it not to be changed at all. And we fear that constant transformation process because what we want is snapshots of time where we can say X was in this condition on this point. And if it continually changes, it really gives us pain. So yeah, we're very much process stuff. We're on the other side of the process wall for sure.
Right. And then it's the kind that you get in Bergson that is seeped down into Deleuze and Simondon and some other more contemporary thinkers is the idea that everything's changing all the time. That's not really what's going on in Latour and Whitehead, where they're talking about individual things as being entirely determined by their configuration in an instant. They're not talking about time moving constantly and everything changing all the time. Some things can stay the same through maintenance processes. And so that's the difference that I talk about when I distinguish between the two kinds of process philosophies. Unfortunately, the word process is somewhat applicable to both cases, and therefore that word sometimes clouds over a very important difference between the two.
So, here So I mentioned sort of when I was tweeting about this event that I am a sort of naive literalist, I come from what you would call in the UK the northern bastard engineering tradition. And, the intention is to make things. I have this habit of following around Bruce about 15 years later, taking the ideas in his stories and attempting to build them into things. So in this case, we've got this work of his.
Why not?
Why not? Somebody's got to do it, right? Think of all the trouble Asimov and Clark closed. So Bruce has this book, Shaping Things, which is, I guess, an academic work about the future of physical objects embedded in networks. When you have I don't have something that fits the description, but if this thing had a little computer in it and took pictures rather than just being a monocular, then, at that point it's sort of connected to a network and, it might be, it might gather feedback on when it couldn't get a good picture because it was too dark, and that could go in future product design and all the rest of it. And, the shaping things stuff is very much, you can look at the shaping things model of how things work through a Latour lens. right? The actor network theory thing is a good fit for the kind of analysis Bruce did in Shaping Things. And so I'm basically like plodding along, attempting to turn the very good thinking that is being done about physical stuff into better physical stuff. Because the physical stuff is really letting us down. You know, like one of the things that comes up in the futurist stuff is this notion that some of the stuff is inherently noxious and toxic. It's predatory. And, you know, like a slot machine is just a machine that feeds on people. It is a predatory thing and it shouldn't be here. You know, if you like your people, you shouldn't let predatory things into the room with them. You know, no killer robots. Well, other than maybe the Bayraktar drones with their selling plush toys. My God, what a world.
Well, that's a tough moral judgment for a crypto coin fan. Shut down the roulette machines, close the casino. Yeah, so, you know, I wrote this book of design theory, Shaping Things, which was, you know, about tracking objects and using objects and kind of giving objects identities and moving them around and so forth. But that was about 20 years ago. And people have tried to do things I was speculating about at the time. And one of them, just to offer a kind of interesting example of these things happening, is a platform called Thingiverse. So in Share Festival, we were very interested in digital manufacturing techniques and physical instantiations of digital objects, right? So you just upload your open source thing to a 3D printer in Thingiverse, and you can offer it to all your friends for free. And so you have this thing, but it's, you know, a rather object-oriented ontology kind of thing, in that the thing in itself, you know, the Ding on Seek, doesn't really exist. There's not like one original or any of the others. It's sort of like a piece of plastic instantiated software. So we were keenly interested in this because we knew tons of 3D printer fans, and still do. We're like upstairs from Torino Fab Lab, which is just celebrating its 10th anniversary. So, and we knew all these MIT Fab Lab characters and had them at our event. And so this was our milieu, and we've got like lots and lots of this stuff. So you would think from a metaphysical point of view that if I upload the instructions to make my plastic object, they're now in the kind of vault of the internet. Well, they'll be sort of permanent, and then, you know, they're almost platonic. I mean, they're like the shadow on the wall, and then every once in a while you get like the actual one, and nobody cares about it very much because it's just made of plastic and you can throw it away. And it's kind of like the cloud of qualities that surrounds the object-oriented object. I mean, you never know the object itself because it's often the mystical internet cyberspace, but then you've got these things that you can give away, and they don't cost very much, and you can make them yourself or buy them down at the art fair or whatever. What I did not understand was that people would get tired of the platform, that the platform itself, which is maintaining all these objects and databases, would have trolls show up, and people would start making elaborate, ridiculous jokes and uploading things that didn't make any sense. And then the original founders of the platform would get bored and nobody would upgrade the software. And then it would be sold to a completely different company who regarded the entire thing as a kind of gigantic white elephant. So in other words, it just kind of became like an old-fashioned metaphysical notion. It still had all the metaphysical stuff that was there. It was just no longer hip. You know, it didn't have any, you know, cool sci-fi-ness about it. And it become corrupted and kind of boringly cliched, and just kind of like many other dead social media platforms. It was just kind of had MySpace fever and is kind of dwindling away. So now I wonder, you know, what's to be done about this? And I especially wonder about things like non-fungible tokens, which are the successor of these kind of early physical objects, right? Okay, you've got non-fungible tokens, the very, very long history of digital art objects, which are infinitely makeable, and they've got, you know, the classic, you know, lack of a Walter Benjamin aura, right? I mean, they're art pieces, but you can't sell them as collector pieces because there's a zillion of them, and all you have to do is press the button, and there's going to be 75 zillion more. But in the case of the non-fungible token, you've got this blockchain application where you can fire up this enormous blockchain and then actually like stick this identifier onto a piece of digital artwork, and then you can sell the blockchain license to the artwork, which is not the thing in itself, but it's actually like an attested semi-legal lump of software description that's like sticking to the thing and suddenly makes it of enormous financial value, right? So of course, me and my pals at Share Festival are keenly aware of this. It's like, wow, finally the artists we love might potentially make a living. And, and now we'll have like some market demand for these digital artworks. And perhaps we'll see some kind of rough assessment of like, what are the best ones? I mean, what do people actually really like? What are they going to like pay for and want to collect? And I buy them. I mean, I don't own a lot of NFTs, but I do buy rather a lot of digital art. I enjoy being an art collector, and I take my art collection on my laptop wherever I go. And I certainly couldn't do that with paintings or, DVDs or a lot of this other stuff. So I'm like a believer here. But I can tell you that after a couple of years of NFT, the most successful non-fungible tokens are basically numismatics. They're not about the artwork. They're actually blockchain art, which is about blockchains and intended to make people in blockchains look good, or else they're more tradable than other kinds. They're like coinage. They have functions. You can like token gate with them. They're more like coins. And the more they become like coins, the more successful they seem to become.
Bruce, are there...
But this is actually a rather Graham Harman style situation, non-fungible tokens, because you've got these objects which seem to be stable and everybody knew what digital art was. And then you've got like this thing, the non-fungible token, which is not the same as the object. It's kind of like divorced. They can drift, you can even destroy the artwork and still have the token. And, you can like go and do all the, the Bruno Latour actions with the token that you ever wanted to do. There's something really metaphysical about them, but they're also powered by just absolute torrents of fierce greed. I mean, just like absolute hand drumming human passion over these things. It's just like fantastic outbursts of, wild enthusiasm, disdain, warfare, theft like you wouldn't believe. The North Koreans just shook down Axie Infinity. They stole 600 million. They're gonna use NFTs to build, nuclear weapons in Pyongyang. It's really just it's a super mess, just like one of the most interesting things I've ever seen, but not particularly artistic. I mean, from the point of view of a curator, I'm not really getting very far with this. I mean, I haven't really seen an elite of artists showing up making NFTs that are actually better than the digital art that I was fond of earlier. What you're basically seeing are digital artists who are suddenly behaving like rather well-paid Hollywood special effects professionals. They immediately turn into that. They become kind of Hollywood FX guys. Suddenly they're industrial light magic. They've got cars, houses, real jobs, but they don't improve the aesthetic merit of digital art in basically any way. I mean, there's very little innovation there. The only digital art innovation there is in NFT is inventing new ways to manipulate them through the blockchain. In that regard, they're super innovative. But in terms of like whether an ape looks better than a crypto punk, no, there's not a lot of artistic development.
It's interesting because you're actually leading to a whole series of questions we have for you, but one in particular, which is, have you followed Terra or Terra X, which is a project, I think it's German architecture students who are trying to use blockchain to give a forest self-management. So in a regard, they're kind of trying to create something like the law of the rights of Mother Earth, creating contracts by which a forest can kind of manage its own carbon credits and lumber timbering. And then a project called the Accursed Share, which has been trying, do you know about them? I don't know as much about them, but they've been trying to kind of liberate images, which Google has kind of, seized and kind of taken on as their own. And so it does seem kind of like there are some art projects that work within tweaking the paradigm of blockchain that I think are doing interesting things. And I would actually sort of locate this notion of Vinay's new contract. I mean, the possibility of using blockchain in some way to actually invent new social relations. To me, that feels like a really fertile field, which then also actually leads to a second question. Then I'll be quiet or turn it over to Liz, which is that I wanted to ask Graham, one of the big critiques, in talking about object-oriented ontology philosophy is anthropocentrism. And I wonder if you think of any kind of contract between humans and objects. I wonder, is there an implied contract, or is there an implied relation between humans and objects that is distinct to your philosophy?
Actually, the relations between humans and objects are pretty central to my philosophy, especially when it comes to art. Because in art and object, what I was actually doing was critiquing the Kantian version of formalism, which talks about how the artwork needs to be separated absolutely from the disinterested beholder, who should remain calm, and we should avoid what Michael Fried calls theatrical art. Whereas the case I made in that book is that the theatrical aspect of art is unavoidable. There are certain kinds of entities that are hybrid entities that require humans as an ingredient, and that doesn't interfere with object-oriented ontology's wish to talk about the autonomy of things apart from us, because what happens is simply that the relation between the human and the object becomes itself a new object. Society is an example of this, right? That society wouldn't exist without the human ingredient, but it does not follow that therefore society is simply what humans can know of it, because in fact we don't understand how society works. And the same thing with the artwork. The human can be an ingredient of the artwork as the beholder without being able to reduce that experience to what we know of it. Just as we cannot reduce our existence as humans to what we are capable of probing through self-consciousness, right? The self is always something deeper than the self's understanding of itself. And so actually there's a lot of room in object-oriented ontology for human involvement in art. In fact, it's required. And that's why architecture became so important for me, because Kant, who's still, he's 200 and some years old, his major works, but he's still probably the most influential aesthetic theorist. He's in the background, either pro or anti, of most aesthetic discourse. And Kant is famously quite dismissive of architecture, right? The problem with architecture is it's useful, which means it's contaminated. It can't be pure beauty, as Kant says. Just like Kant is suspicious of human beauty because he thinks it's always contaminated by lust. And even the beauty of a horse is contaminated by our thought of, wow, that could probably ride really fast. I can win a lot of money by betting on it. Whereas beauty is supposed to be something we approach in a completely disinterested way. Well, architecture therefore fails Kant's test. But if it turns out, as I have argued in my art book, that art is always already contaminated with theatricality, then architecture is no longer special in that regard, right? In fact, architecture is facing up to something that visual art does not face up to, which is the fact that all art is somehow entangled with the human ingredients. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's the direction I would take it.
That's a really useful and provocative, approach from my point of view, because in our Technology Art Festival, we have a whole lot of interactive devices. So, the human moves into the space, the device sees it and reacts in some pre-programmed way. And, it's not a matter of Kant standing by and like doing some kind of geometric assessment of the, tonal values of a painting. On the contrary, in our show, if you have something going on and it doesn't do anything, people tend to dismiss it as a screensaver, whereas they line up for the ones that where you move into a space and something happens. But then you have the problem of how do you aesthetically assess that interaction, right? I mean, what's a good interactive space like? I mean, what is it supposed to do? Is it supposed to be pretty? Is it supposed to be circus-like? And, we tend to err on the side of, Lovecraftian frisson, really. I mean, the things that we've had that have been most successful have had spine creepy things going on. Like Emmanuel Andel's knife hand chop bot, where you go in and you put your hand under a robot knife and it begins jabbing up and down in the space between your fingers, moving faster and faster. Okay, that sounds like a very sinister artwork indeed, because, it could lop your hand off. And point of fact is well programmed. There's simply no way it's going to do it. But it was one of the most successful art exhibits we ever had. People were literally lined up out of the door to put their human hand in front of an artwork and perhaps get a spurt of blood and, and screams, right? I'm inclined to think that was actually an aesthetic kind of, it was not merely a grand guignol kind of horror thing. On the contrary, there was something going on, not just between the viewer and the program machine, but in the society of people who were lining up to watch to see how brave the person was and whether something horrible would happen, right? I mean, the atmosphere around that installation was really electric. And, it just had more artistic charisma than pretty much any other similar object that we've ever put on display.
Well, I think you're pointing to...
We would appreciate a better vocabulary for talking about this. And also, we kind of need it even among ourselves when we're having our yearly jury meeting, when we have to convince one another to valorize object A over, installation B. I mean, what is it that we're supposed to be doing here?
I think you're pointing to a really interesting paradox, Bruce, and that we're not switching.
Yeah.
You're pointing to a really interesting
I hear you fine.
paradox in that you're looking at NFTs. When I first heard about NFTs, I thought they were sort of an answer to Benjamin and the authenticity of the object. But you're pointing to this really interesting place where it's the contract that people are activating. You're pointing to the use of blockchain and activating the contract as the most interesting NFTs. And there's something about trying to recreate this relationship, this effective relationship, by using technology. And that's a really interesting point to look at a turn in digital art, because how do you evaluate a generative pixel-based program, right? I mean, it looks like glitch art, but can you say that one piece of glitch art is better than the other? So how can you bring that relationship back into it?
I am convinced that you can, in fact, say that one piece of glitch art is better than the other. And I don't really have a good, solid way to say it. I've seen absolute megatons of glitch art. And I could further tell you that if you want to hang out in the NFT scene and see generative art, some of it very glitchy, which is actually good, you can simply go to feralfile.com, where they actually have guys. Yeah, feralfile.com is probably the most interesting digital art gallery in the world right now, in that it is an NFT gallery, but these are people who are visibly struggling to improve their work. And a lot of them are design teachers, and they're veteran coders and open source coding people, and they're the top-notch people internationally in Feralfile. And yeah, I buy their stuff. And I know a lot of them, and some of them have even been on our jury and so forth. They've been guests at our festival. So yeah, if you want to see something that's actually good art, go check out Feralfile. You can ignore everything else I said after that. But nevertheless, yeah, somebody has to make aesthetic distinctions between pieces of generative art, because I can throw a bucket of paint off a 7-story building, and that will attract a large crowd. It will really be spectacular when it hits the ground and spatters, and people will come up from several blocks around. But if I throw a second bucket of paint, no. And if I throw 10, people simply leave. Okay, that's a problem. That's the problem between an artwork and a gimmick, or pulling a rabbit out of the hat. Okay, I can pull a rabbit out of a hat, and that's a theatrical entertainment. But if I try to pull 100 rabbits out of my hat and distribute them to everybody in the audience and have them sell it to one another like comic books or novels, that simply doesn't work, right? So yeah, I see tons of glitch. I've read a lot about glitch. I could go on about it. I don't know. It's a peculiar thing to be an art critic about, but it is in fact possible to be an art critic about generative work.
For sure, I don't disagree with that. I think our kind of interest in this nexus is the way that objects create contracts, and how can you use the current tech to enhance that? Because you seem to be pointing to this direction that you saw in NFTs, and that they were trying to use the contractual aspect.
Which Vinay has.
Okay, well, there is the technical progress issue, which is a kind of a different but related thing. Like if I'm a technology artist, am I trying to improve the hardware and software and like make better art because the hardware is better? And in this case, you've got OpenAI's DALL-E 2, which came out like maybe a month ago, which is a hugely powerful neural net.
Yeah.
You know, using a lot of Zuckerberg money. And you can tell DALL-E to draw practically anything. Draw a blue Yeti flying through the galaxy with rainbow wings, and it will immediately do a portrait based on basically any verbal command that you give it. And it will do that portrait, that picture, to basically any level of detail in any style. Do it like Matisse, do it like Rembrandt. I mean, you look at this thing and it's like, yeah, it's the creepiest and most potent AI art I've seen yet. And there exists basically no aesthetic basis for saying whether one DALL-E production is better, quote unquote, than another DALL-E production, or whether DALL-E is a better platform than some other rival AI generative system, because it is a generative system. It just happens to be a neural net generative system, which is based on a huge database of basically every drawing or painting ever made in the history of the human race.
Yeah.
So yeah, you can look at that one, and it's the opposite of glitch. It's not glitch at all. It's computer generated. Humans don't draw a line in it, except for humans drew lines in the database. But it is a super accomplished draftsman. It can do 3D, it can do tinting, chiaroscuro, perspective, anything you want. This thing will whip that baby out. Of course, it has no idea what it's doing. It's not an artificial general intelligence. It's merely a generative system, but it's probably the most technically impressive generative system that humankind has ever made.
It's funny, we had a question from a friend who first became familiar with your work long ago through like Mondo 3000 and Negative Land and kind of that era. And to think back to that time of kind of this sort of wild west of sampling and copyright, and now looking at Vinay's project and the possibility of this kind of archive of all things, in which I do see incredible social potential, the juxtaposition is kind of astounding to me. And so sort of, I guess, for both of you, I'm just kind of curious, because I know Vinay's project is so much about ecological remediation or reducing redundancy and actually trying to, intervene in ecological devastation. So it's an incredibly strange moment, I think, that we live in with these things.
Yeah, it's weird times. I was horrified when Go went down. It's like, oh, wow, there's a computer that could beat all known humans in Go. I'm like, I didn't think I'd live to see that, Go was the, like the sort of, it was like the South Pole of, computer AI problems. Then it's like I would have expected like software writing to go down before visual art. And, if I was a young painter at this point, I would just be looking at this stuff like, okay, we're screwed. It's done. Like game over, in much the same way that the Go players became very disenchanted when the AI overtook Go. I just, what's next? Like poetry, is that coming next? Like how far into what you think of as being the inherent humanity stuff is the machine going to get? And why is it so much more successful at the right brain stuff than the left brain stuff? I can't say to an AI, like, give me a spreadsheet with the inflation-adjusted price of a pair of shoes for America and Germany and compare the two and tell me what the difference is. That's not here yet, but, I can say, like, give me a stormtrooper in the style of Matisse and I can have one immediately. It's just, I never expected it to be so inside of people so quickly. It's super.
I think that's actually, a bit of a phantom there, because what you're dealing with there is not a creature that can draw. What you're dealing with there is statistical relationships between a very large database. So, it can generate poetry, but it doesn't know what it's talking about, and it can draw, but it can't see.
Yes.
It doesn't have any eyes.
Absolutely.
It can't actually create. It can create stuff, and it can create relationships between objects, but it's not a general artificial intelligence, which is, I mean, it can ruin other people's lives in some ways. Like, I wouldn't be surprised if it could like take over a lot of logo design, but and it's not even lifeless. It actually has a kind of interesting aesthetic, but it's not actually doing art production in a humanly creative way.
No, not at all.
No, it's just sort of like baking a very large database, and then it's got a kind of method to scrape the cream off the top. You know, I'm actually a little surprised that it hasn't done more, because I've been following neural net development since 2012 when it had just this real boom. And, you know, it can play really great Go, but a machine that can play really great Go can't play poker.
Yeah.
And it's not like it doesn't matter that a machine can play poker. A machine that can play poker and can slaughter everybody can just cheat you online, or, you know, whatever. But we're not in a condition of, you know, being replaced by RUR Karl Čapek robots, which are usurping our essential humanity. We don't have an essential humanity. And our relationship to this is something that you kind of get used to. And I have seen a lot since the days of Mondo 2000, but it's actually sort of rare to see a technological development come out of nowhere and like leap up the slope to the plateau of productivity in very short order. I mean, watching things, you sort of see them happening. What you lack is like a good way to talk about them, and kind of, you also lack like a good method to improve them. Like, okay, you know, there's a ton of DALL-E stuff, and like, yeah, you can have your Matisse Stormtrooper, but you can have 1,000 Matisse Stormtroopers, but which one is the best?
Which one's a good one?
Yeah.
Can I take 1 second to name check Mondo 2000? So, you know, I kind of am where I am today because in 1980s Scotland, you know, there was nothing. It was rural Scotland in the 1970s was a wasteland like which you can't imagine. It wasn't much better in the 80s. And I came across Mondo 2000 in a shop that sold Dungeons and Dragons books. And the entire course of my life changed in like two editions. You know, like 2 copies of that magazine. It was like, okay, that's what I'm doing. I'm off to America. That's where the action is. Here we go. It was just like this beacon in the darkness, which is super weird because, it was like there was no way of knowing at that point that Mondo 2000 wasn't completely real. You know, from the perspective of the other side of the world, you know, sort of Scottish Newtown, one of these kind of, you know, council estate, you know, kind of Ballardian nightmare sort of contexts. You know, it seemed like that was where the action was, and sure enough it was. There was no way of knowing that every word in that thing was not gospel true. It was a crazy experience of just getting pulled out of, you know, this very dead-end context by something that turned out to be basically a unicorn.
I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of stuff in there that made perfect sense to the guys who were in the Mondo mansion. They're Californians, okay? They're from the granola state. They drink their own bathwater, and they were happy to live in that particular realm. You know, and as a science fiction writer, you know, I create lots of weird fantasies and throw them over the transom. And it often surprises me that people show up 20 years later and say, "Did you know you were writing such sober, realistic work?" Like Guerrilla, you know, it's like, "Did you know you were a prophet of a dystopian future society?" It's like, okay, you're projecting, all right? That's not what was actually going on at the time, and it's not something you should fuss about. I do fuss a little bit about the lack of a good clearinghouse for ideas along this line. Like, it'd be hard to do Graham Harman's Triple O Quarterly, the Triple O Aesthetic Quarterly. You know, if you had something like Neural, which is like Italy's best known technology art mag out of Milan. I mean, you know, I'm a big fan of Neural, and unlike Mondo 2000, they don't talk utter hallucinatory crap. I mean, the people at Neural are not high all the time, okay? They're actually Milanese, you know, aestheticians and technology fans who are trying to cover the Italian and European tech scene. So they're very useful and helpful. But in the case of these arguments that we have at Share Festival, or arguments in things like robot art, kinetic art, net.art, digital manufacturing, commonly you sound like you're shouting into a void, and you find the same wheel is reinvented again and again. It's like, didn't you realize Billy Clover did that in Experiments in Art and Technology at Bell Labs in 1969? It's like nobody knows. Right? I mean, it's closer to metaphysics in that way, and that you just keep going back to Kant, or even the pre-Socratic philosophers. This is like the pre-Socratic philosophers. It's like that guy who said everything was made of air. It's like, okay, in metaphysics, that's exciting news. And it's also a kind of exciting news in tech art, which is a shame because there's not a canon for it. And there's not really much aesthetic rigor in like how things are assessed. And also the guys who are involved in it tend to be doing it as a hobby. I mean, they're actual coders and they make net art on the weekends, or they're actual engineers and they built an interactive device in mom's basement in Bremen. They're dilettantes and hobbyists, which is not to say that they can't do interesting and good work. It's just it's hard to make them into Andy Warhol. You just can't actually. It's like being Beeple, Mike, who's the NFT guy, just fairly common guy doing a lot of cool Photoshop memes, and suddenly he gets $69 million dropped on his head, so he's going to be quite famous for the rest of his life. But it's sort of hard to do anything with Mike after that, right? I mean, it's kind of hit by lightning, as opposed to an artist who you can sort of encourage year by year and sort of say, oh, well, she's advanced from this to the other. And this was her blue period, and this was the part where she did this. And at this point, she became very interested in perspex. You just, it's hard to maintain this kind of standard art world career for the productive people. And
it's funny when you mention the pre-Socratics.
Yeah.
I've never noticed the Ethereum to Materium movement in Vinay's work. There's actually a question in the chat here, which is really for Graham, but then leads into a second question, which is actually for both Vinay and Graham. There was someone, Graham, who was curious why, when you spoke about architecture, you talked about theatricality rather than utility.
Utility would fall under the same umbrella as what I'm using to discuss theatricality. It's a kind of hybrid object in which the human is involved. Now, that doesn't mean humans are involved in every object. That's why I'm still a realist, because water is a hybrid of hydrogen and oxygen, whether humans are there or not. So you don't need a human ingredient in every entity, but there are some entities that require human ingredients, like art, like society, like basketball. I mean, sometimes people ask me, what would art without humans be like? And I answer, what would basketball without humans be like? Or what would water without hydrogen be like? It's in some sense a nonsensical question. So that's all I mean when I talk about theatricality. I'm simply borrowing that word from Michael Fried, and I'm trying to draw an analogy between the theatricality that he opposes in visual arts and the utility that always has to be involved in architecture in some way, unless you turn it into sculpture. That's what differentiates architecture from sculpture. Can I go back, though, and comment on one thing that Bruce said a couple of minutes ago? Because when they were discussing about computers being able to take over human activities, Bruce made up what I thought was the key point, which is the computer can churn out 100 dollies, but which one's the best one? And I think that's the key to the problem, because it doesn't bother me if computers take over certain human aspects of procedures that we used to think were essential to the procedures. Computers do a lot of things for architects now that architects used to have to do by hand. We wouldn't say that architecture is over. Even if computers could generate better competition entries for buildings, you would still need a human jury to decide which is the best one. I mean, I have very conservative music-loving friends who hate hip-hop for the sole reason that the hip-hop musicians are sampling and not playing the instruments themselves. But to me, that's kind of beside the point, right? Because there's still a musical activity involved in sampling, choosing the right samples to put together. If I had a computer that could write my philosophy books for me, like choose 10 finalists for me, and then I read through them and decide which one I'm going to put my name on it, I don't think I would stop being a philosopher for that reason, right? If the computer could be programmed to say the kinds of things I would say, and then I just pick the one that sounds most like what I think, I don't think you could say philosophy is over. It's just that the computer will be doing a lot of the legwork for me. What's really important is that I'm the one deciding what makes philosophical sense in the results. So I'm less bothered by that aspect of computers taking things over. I think in the case of Go and chess, it is a big crisis because there's not that level of curatorship in those things, right? The human move making is actually the important thing. I think in a lot of other activities, I'm not sure it would bother me that much if computers were actually doing the heavy lifting.
Yeah, if I've been telling people for about 10 years, the reason that I talk so much on Twitter is that I'm deliberately building a training set for an AI that will then be able to do a lot of my work for me. And people used to think that I was joking about that. And now it's getting to the point. It's just like, so what can you do with like a 1.5 million word corpus? Like, oh, and you know, it might be 2 or 3 years before we have AutoGupta. But I'm expecting AutoGupta to sit there and like filter my news and find me the interesting things and reply to people when they want to, you know, some reference to some piece of work that I've done. You know, like I'm very carefully just incrementally documenting so that when the time comes for me to get some, you know, real mechanical assistance here, there'll be a data set for the damn thing to work with, which sounds nuts today, maybe even will, but a lot less nuts than it did 10 years ago. We were approaching some thresholds here. And I mean, you know, that whole thing about the Chinese room, you know, the sort of, you know, Searle's Robert, do you remember the first name?
Was it Ron?
John Searle.
John Searles. Because I know somebody else called Searles. I was getting confused. So yeah.
Searle, no S on the end.
Searle. Okay, yeah, there we go. So, you know, this notion that we're now basically locked in the Chinese room, you know, like more and more of the stuff in our environment is going to be generated by these damn things. You know, I feel at that point, this question about like, you know, if we've got sort of a machine telling the story and a machine listening to the story, and then a machine telling a human whether the story is any good and whether they should listen to it too, you know, weird things are happening where the filters are in the process of beginning to learn. Like, it can't be that long until filters develop aesthetics. You know, right now I have a spam filter, okay, it picks out spam. But, you know, give me a Netflix filter. Just, yo, robot, watch Netflix and tell me what I'm going to watch that I like. I don't want Netflix's robot to do that. I want my robot to do it. You know, it's digested 1.5 million of my tweets. It ought to be able to understand what my taste is. Go watch some TV for me and tell me what's good. Yeah, go watch some TV for me and give me a plot summary. Just like, you know, be like my friend in the morning who just tells me what it was that they watched on TV last night. You know, I just wonder whether we're going to wind up with machines that do aesthetic consumption for us in the same way that we have machines that do aesthetic production for us.
Well, you want a personal recommendation engine then.
Yeah. But
there's a lot of AI applications in the big recommendation engines. I mean, the neural nets are exceedingly keen on that. Twitter's got them. Yeah. Like Twitter stories are all a neural net combing through everything you looked at and trying to interest you in what comes next. On the Chinese box thing, I think some of the weird developments we've had in the past couple of years are directly attributable to people actually having to live in Chinese boxes. I mean, people were under quarantine and they couldn't leave the house, and they had to do all their work and even their cultural activity through boxes like this. And I think that in retrospect, NFT art is going to be seen as not just blockchain art, but lockdown art. Because it was a form of art you could do when you couldn't go to the gallery and you might die if you went to the museum. So when everything's mediated by screens, this has actually had a really big effect on my world because, you know, stuff that was done digitally was off in a room by itself. Whereas every curator in Europe and every European apparatchik has had to live alone in a room, tapping the return key and like talking into their iPad for a couple of years. And, you know, that's a change in our society that I think is way underestimated. I mean, we actually did have to live in the boxes, but it doesn't mean, I mean, recommendation engines are not very good at aesthetics. They could tell you that a guy like Vinay will look at a thing like this, but they can't tell you why Fellini's 8.5 is a better movie than Fellini's E Vitellone. Right? Mm-hmm. And even in limited areas where there's like computer mastery, like chess, and you've got neural nets like AlphaZero that can absolutely hammer any human being at chess and even hammer the previous generation of chess engines. They're one of the very few chess engines that does games that are pretty. I mean, games that chess fans are willing to watch because they have an aesthetic. They don't just want to watch somebody wipe the floor with somebody else. They want to see a beautiful game, which is, appeals to their chess aesthetic, which it's not like a painter's aesthetic, but it's more like a mathematics aesthetic. And I was watching these, AlphaZero games, and I was very impressed by the beauty of AlphaZero's play. But since it wiped the floor with Stockfish and these other creatures, other engines 4 or 5 years ago, it has never gotten any prettier. It came out of nowhere and it mastered the game to the extent that it ever mastered the game, but it never did anything even more aesthetically remarkable than it did.
The sophomore slump. You solve the problem.
You would think that somebody would build a rival AlphaZero and set it on this one and have that immediately crush it. It's just we've got twice the power, so it's playing twice as beautiful a game. It's or we'll just accelerate the chips, we'll just overclock it and it'll be even more impressive. No, it seems to have topped out.
Right.
At a level of expertise that's hard for people to measure, but it's not the most beautiful thing in the world. So,
right.
I'm not sure how that is. I don't understand why it hasn't happened.
Yeah, that's fascinating, because it does suggest that
I don't understand why somebody can't train an AlphaZero on all the most beautiful games and then have a machine that simply plays unbelievably pretty chess.
Yes, yeah.
Maybe losing a lot of the time, right? But just if a machine can master chess aesthetics, it ought to be able to play the most elegant chess.
Right.
Yeah. Not just winning. And when you watch AlphaZero win, it usually wins at the end with a 1-pawn advantage. Because that's the simplest way. It's why should I come up with a fantastic complex mating thing? It never sets tracks, it never tricks, it doesn't psychologically overpower the lesser player because it has no psychology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something about this.
There are limits to the beauty of its play.
Is that because of the capitalist mode of production that made it? Is it just that it was the best, and then at that point,
it's because neural nets and statistics are like that. It's because it's a neural net playing itself several billion times.
Yeah.
Evolving toward an area where it wins consistently.
Best in the world, so there's nobody to learn from.
Yeah.
What's that earlier question, a two-parter? I think we got to part one and then we kind of went off on a bunch of very interesting things.
You hear the question is, when Aristotle distinguishes between instrument, and this is for both Vinay and Graham, when Aristotle distinguishes between instrumental and intrinsic goods, his only example of something that is purely an instrumental good is money. Can you each tell us what object orientology or materium has to say about the issue of intrinsic versus instrumental good?
Better go first. I don't know anything about Aristotle.
I think the question was more about intrinsic and instrumental goods than about Aristotle, but I'm happy to take a crack at it first. Kind of improvising here, though. Probably has something to do with what I was saying about architecture, or what I haven't said about architecture yet, but that's in my book. Instrumentality is a form of relationality. One thing has its being in its relation to another thing. So money would have its being for Aristotle in the fact that it's used to acquire something else that supposedly has an intrinsic value, like water. You're thirsty, so you buy a bottle of water. That would be an intrinsic good. You need to, I suppose you could also say water is instrumental because it's in order to preserve your well-being. And so water is just an instrument to preserve your well-being. You could keep doing something like that. That's what Heidegger does when he says that all tools are ready to hand, they're linked to some other purpose. And then ultimately he says, for the sake of Dasein, for the sake of ourselves, is the ultimate source of meaning for everything that exists. I would look at it slightly more broadly. I would look at it as looking at instrumentality in terms of relationality, and look at the intrinsic in terms of something that has an autonomous existence apart from its relationality. And let's talk about the case of architecture really quickly, just to give you a brief preview of the book. The main pair of oppositional terms in architecture is form and function. And in practice, how that's usually been interpreted over the years is that the function is the purpose of the building and the form is the visual look. There's problems with both of those, however, it turns out. What's wrong with saying that the function of the building is its purpose? Well, Aldo Rossi wrote this important book in the 60s called The Architecture of the City. And of course, he's Italian, and they live around their history in a way that most nationalities do not. He points out that many buildings change their function over time or never had a clear function. These are what he calls monuments. And so in a way, when you're talking about monuments, you're talking about something that's there that helps shape the city, but it's something deeper than any particular purpose. Or even SCI-Arc. Bruce has been to visit us at SCI-Arc. SCI-Arc started out as a freight rail station in downtown Los Angeles over 100 years ago. And since then, it's been a homeless hangout. I met an Uber driver who used to bribe the homeless to leave for a night so he could hold raves in there. So it's also a rave site. And then finally, it was converted into an architecture school in the late 90s. And so none of those is really its function, right? Because it's even being an architecture school, it could be sold to a blockchain developer in the future, and we move somewhere else. So really, the function of SCI-Arc is something more like protracted vertical movement along a narrow corridor, because that's what's been preserved of it. You're always going to run into everybody as you're walking through SCI-Arc, unless you try to avoid people by going outside and coming back in at the other end, because there's just one corridor, basically. So our director jokes that you don't have to schedule meetings because he just sees anybody by walking from one end to the other. And then in terms of the form, the visual look of a building cannot really be the form, because first of all, you can't see the whole building from one place. So some kinetic displacement is required. And that's just on the exterior. If you want to go on the interior, architecture is a temporal art, and it's a kind of sequence of memories that architecture is really about. A sequence of kinetic memories of what it was like to move through things. And unlike a novel or a film, you're in control of how long you're going to spend in each place in the architecture. You can reverse direction for a while. So it's a little more like a video game in that sense. I mean, I realize video games have levels, but in a video game, you're free to move around a level within certain limits, at least in first and third person shooter games. So the way to get something intrinsic is to derelationize it. And I know relations are all the rage these days, and Binet makes a good case for why objects need to be looked at relationally also, as does Latour. But ultimately, I think you get something in things when you derelationize them. And that's why I just wrote an article I wasn't expecting to write about why shipwrecks are sometimes better than the original ships. You know, there's this old paradox in philosophy called the ship of Theseus, namely how much detail can you take away from the ship and it's still the same ship. I kind of take the opposite tack on that and say sometimes it's better to subtract the detail. The shipwreck and the rotting of the wreck kind of leaves something essential. And the same about ruins. It's almost better to look at a ruined ancient Greek city than it is to visit the actual city. That'd be nice too. But time and ruins somehow leaves something essential in things that wasn't there when all the detail was there.
There's something fantastic to that. You know, the shells of things. Same thing with, like, you know, fallen trees. It's a different story. So, I mean, one of my other hats is that I spent a long time on disaster relief. Long time, trying to figure out how to do systemic work to handle hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And for that kind of scale, you have to basically work with the existing industrial base, and you can do minimal processing on the stuff produced by the existing industrial base. You just have to buy it in 100,000 ton quantities. There's no real time or money to transform it in any way, and then you dump it into the field. You know, if you're going to purify water for hundreds of millions of people, you're going to wind up with chlorine, bleach, and plastic buckets, because that's the only stuff that you can buy in the kind of quantities that will make a difference at that scale. Not because you run out of money, but because nobody can manufacture enough of anything fancy. You know, if you want to put straw filters, you know, like hiking and camping people would use 100 million units of scale, they're never going to be able to provide it. You know, the manufacturing isn't there. And a lot of what goes along with that kind of thinking is a sort of radical simplification of how we assess the effectiveness of aid, in that there's no metric worth using at that scale other than dollars per life saved. You know, and what I'm pointing at is that there is a sort of, you know, I don't want to say an aesthetic of necessity, but there's a thing that happens where you say, right, here's our metric. Our metric is dollars per life saved. And then there is a certain set of processes that come from dollars per life saved, which is you buy cheap stuff in enormous quantities, and then you give people simple instructions on how to use it. And if they get it wrong, they die. because you can't provide the support services at that level of scale. You just literally, people are on your own. 1 in 100 or 1 in 10 has a cell phone with instructions on it, and other than that, get on with it. So there is something that happens when you go all the way to pure existential function. At one end you have the kind of pure aesthetic, and then in the middle you've got architecture, and then at the worst case you have triage. Whether it's triage in a hospital emergency room, whether it's triage in a kind of mass refugee camp, whether it's triage in some kind of military field hospital, wherever it happens to be, there is a point where you get down to the price of saving this one person's life could be the death of 2 other people, and you've got to decide who you're going to do first. And that sort of notion of triage as being like where shit gets ultimately real. I quite like this idea that we have a kind of everything is somewhere between, aesthetics and triage, and different things at different points along that. But it is the opposite of aesthetics. People that are familiar with the market in that area are often like, my God, Vinny, that's really an ugly building. And I'm like, yeah, but it's super efficient.
What was the main difference between your tent and existing tents?
Yeah, okay. So there's basically 2 things. Actually 3. So the design specification for the Hexyard was that it would be a relocatable shelter. There was a thing called the Sustainable Settlements Charrette run by Rocky Mountain Institute about 2002, maybe? It must have been 2002. And what came out of that was a brief that said, we want a shelter where the refugees live in the shelter, and when it's time for the refugees to go home, you fold the shelters up, you throw on the back of the truck, you drive to the location, and then you put the shelter up again. So it goes from being disaster relief in one context to development aid in the other. And they came to me and said, Vinny, could you do something like that? And I'm like, I'm a software engineer, but I'll take a crack. And 7 years before that, I had spent 6 months redesigning Buckminster Fuller's geodesic dome to make it more efficient. And I had spent 6 months failing, right? I went over that thing backside and foremost because the hippies on the farm in Tennessee said, look, we keep making these geodesic domes, they're great, but when we cut them out of 4x8 sheet, we're throwing away a quarter of the material because the big triangles for the domes don't fit on the 4x8 sheet. So they had the practical field experience, they passed the question on to me. I spent 6 months working on it and failed. 7 years later, the disaster relief guys are like, Vinny, can you make a shelter that's relocatable? And I'm like, sure. And I went back to that Fuller problem, literally got out, I think it was literally on the back of an envelope, drew out a 4x8 sheet and said, okay, what's the simplest thing that could possibly work? Which is a classic question from software engineering. Cut it in half, and 15 minutes later, we had the Hexyard. So the first thing was standard industrial panel materials, relocatable, because if you build it in some kind of plastic, you could just pressure wash it, foldable so you could move it. And then, so that's the first kind of cluster. The second thing is hard-sided materials equals insulation. You can build them in plywood, no real insulation, but if you build them out of foam or honeycomb polypropylene or something like that, you get insulation. And insulated buildings are so much better than tents, both for hot climates and cold climates. So the main foothold the Hexyard has in the world is they build about 10,000 people's worth of shelters every year for Burning Man. And some of that's Hexyard, and now some of it's a second generation thing called a shift pod. The people are hand building these things because they're just so much better than tents. So that's the kind of second cluster. And then the third cluster is the big lie of the tent is that the tent is there as a solution. And the tent is not there as a solution. The tent is there as an advertising hoarding for whatever agency prints their name on the outside of the tents. The tents are gone in 3 months to a year, depending on climate, because they rot. Ultraviolet light damages them, they get moldy, they're just, you don't want to do that. So because the Hexyard is designed as a permanent building that you can move, the idea is you put something on the ground that's going to be there in 20 years, right? And you can't get there with cheap materials, but you can get there with inexpensive materials. One branch of it. And then the other branch of it is that if we go into really serious mass production, there is a version of the Hexyard which uses, craft paper, this very cheap, very hard brown paper that comes out of some very simple industrial process. So you have a craft paper honeycomb sandwiched between 2 layers of the same aluminium that they use for Coke cans. And you factory seal the edges and put in moisture absorbing crystals. And what you get out of that is a thing where you can build a complete building that will last as long as a Coke can skin will last in the outdoors for about $100 to $150 a building. And so you get to a point where you're paying like a third of what a disaster relief tent costs for a building that will last for decades and is fully insulated. And you just need scale of manufacturing to get to the point where you can figure out how to take these big sheets of cheap aluminium foil that are super protected by, lacquers and the precise alloy and all the rest of that stuff. The stuff is about €1 a square meter. You, literally, as soon as you can figure out how to machine and seal the edges of that in an appropriate way, you can literally house people for a third of the price of tents. So it was just this thing of like, it was the full weight of the Buckminster Fuller perspective filtered through 50 years of hippie experience building geodesics, which got passed to me, and then all these disaster relief people who had a different model of what the problem was, they passed that to me, and that was, we just came out with the thing. And then the disaster relief world has basically just refused to touch it with a metric barge pole for 20 freaking years because it's too cheap and it lasts too long. I once saw somebody from UN High Commission on Refugees hiss at Hexia. They literally hissed. I know exactly what that is, and I'm not setting foot inside of it. And I'm like, right, okay, fine. Let's see what we're doing here. So yeah, that's why it's different from a 10. It's different because the UN hates it, and it's different because it actually works. And these two facts are not unrelated.
Thanks so much for describing that for us, Vinay. We should probably begin to wrap up, and we have one final crowdsourced question that is directed at Graham, but it would be great to kind of have Graham answer and then have the rest of our panelists kind of chime in on this. And the question is that this person would love to know what the second generation of object-oriented ontology should look like. Will it follow the trends of past movements in continental thought, becoming a pervasive presence in cultural theory and in the arts? This is obviously already happening to some extent. What about O novels, films, etc.? I know a O architectural style is already beginning to develop. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this happening in other art forms.
Every now and then I hear from someone who says they've been inspired to do this or that. I even had a DJ contact me a few times and said he was doing object-oriented DJing. I never quite heard what the whole story on that is. The O approach to aesthetics generally has to do with the separation explicitly between objects and their qualities. And I've written about that. These guys have read Object-Oriented Ontology, A New Theory of Everything from Pelikan. I talk about metaphor there. Metaphor isn't the only such case, but it's one case where you have a transfer of qualities from one object to another object mediated by the theatrical beholder who ratifies that by accepting its existence. And that could be applied to just about any fields, aesthetic or even otherwise. And so it's hard to make predictions. I only have some level of indirect control over what's happening in architecture because I have students and I have colleagues. And visual arts, I've had some experience dealing with visual artists who have tried to adapt it to their idiom. I would just say this, repeat an old point about the visual arts, which is that when O first started creeping into the visual arts, again, people assumed that what it was about is removing humans from the arts. But actually, that's just an extension of the old Kantian formalism. So as I've written about, there was a good Polish-American artist named Joanna Malinowska who did a show back in 2010 called Time of Guerrilla Metaphysics, which was influenced by my second book, Guerrilla Metaphysics. And her idea was to take a solar-powered boombox and march towards the North Pole. And it was solar-powered. It was playing Glenn Gould playing Bach fugues. And then her idea was to leave this boombox on the ice shelf somewhere, then leave it there where no one is hearing it. And she goes back to New York. And so now there's this artwork that nobody's experiencing. And it's an interesting idea, but that's not really what O is about, because as I thought about it, it took me a while to figure this out. But for one thing, it's not really an artwork that nobody is hearing because people are thinking about it, right? It's a gesture of conceptual arts. It fits well within the genre of conceptual arts. It makes an impact on the art scene because she's telling us about it. Even if it existed only in her mind and she didn't communicate about it to anybody, it's still not really a O work because a O work should be O even if it's right here in front of us. Right? The fact that something is distant from time and space from humans isn't really the point. That's more Meillassoux point in his book After Finitude, Ancestrality. For Meillassoux, something is a thing in itself if it can exist before humans and exist after we're extinct. Mm-hmm. Whereas for me, something exists in itself if it's here now and we can't master it, we can't grasp it. It doesn't have to be hidden. So what O aesthetics is not about getting rid of humans. Right? It's not about Joseph Beuys letting a coyote run through an art gallery alone at night when no one's in there. Those are clever ideas, but it's about finding some way to signal the absence of the thing from a complete mastery by the beholder. And the way that happens, I've argued, is through a deliberate separation of the object from its qualities, as opposed to literal experience in which an object is nothing more than its qualities. And in fact, in knowledge, more generally, an object is identified with its qualities. And so as I've written before, if somebody asks you what something is, there are only two kinds of answers you can give. You can tell them what it's made of, or you can tell them what it does. Those are the only two kinds of knowledge that exist. And that's fine. We need that knowledge. Like if I have symptoms and I go to the hospital, I want somebody to figure out what it's made of. What is the thing that's causing those symptoms? And if I can imagine many converse cases where I just want to know what a thing does. If I buy a tool, I want to know all the uses it has for it. I don't care about the mysterious withdrawn kernel of its being. I just want to know all the different things it can be used for. But those two do not give you a complete cognitive picture of the object. I call that undermining and overmining the object. And it gives us a lot about the object, but it doesn't give us everything. Right? It doesn't give us what the thing itself is, because a thing is more than its parts. Right? It has emergent features that aren't found in the parts, like water puts out fire, even though both of its parts fuel fire. And then water is also something deeper than all of its uses. First of all, because it has many possible uses we haven't thought about. And second of all, because even if we knew all the possible uses, those wouldn't quite exhaust what it is for water to exist. So there is a kind of third term in between. And then people come back and say, but that's just the negative theology, right? Triple O is just telling us what something is not what it is. But there's a third alternative to knowledge and negative theology, and that alternative is philosophy. That's what philosophia means. It means you love wisdom, you don't have it. You're somewhere in between. And this is Socrates' whole point when he's arguing with Meno in Plato's dialogue, the Meno. Meno says, maybe the sophists are right. You can't look for something if you have it, and you can't look for it if you don't, because you already have it, you're not looking for it, which means you know it. And if you don't know it at all, you won't recognize it when you find it. And so therefore, there's no point looking for anything. That's the sophist position. Whereas Socrates says, no, but the point is you have it and you don't have it. You're kind of somewhat embedded in, I wouldn't say the truth, I would say in reality. I don't like when people talk about truth, because in philosophy, when people talk about truth, those are usually the people who think they already have it and they want to beat you over the head with it. People who claim to love truth the most. I like reality. Reality is something that you can't quite formulate as a truth, but it's paradoxical or surprising, and you have to come to grips with it. And so that I use reality more. But for me, when you're talking about things, you're talking about dealing with the reality of things, not with the knowledge about them, not with the truth about them. Mm-hmm. All right, so I'll leave it at that.